feel like God's flashlight is now shining. Hey, good morning, everyone. How are you?
This is just
Good, exactly. I feel that level of Brussels energy just radiating out of
Maybe
the
that's
audience
why.
this morning. I hope you all had a really spectacular night, at least half as good as the great day we had yesterday. I just want to say a word of greeting and warm hello this morning. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Planet, and it's my great pleasure to be here with you this morning with such an incredibly august and really diverse group of thinkers and innovators and stakeholders in this kind of collective enterprise we have around innovating in this space for social and ecological, lasting social and ecological systems change. To my immediate left is a man who was non-ironically referred to last night over dinner in my presence as the Godfather, and needs little introduction. Oh, grandfather, Godfather, grandfather. You get the general gist of this. And Matt Hansen, as I think you all know from University of Maryland and GLAD and the primogenitor of data that drives, and really a kind of living testament to the ways in which making things visible and then making them accessible ultimately makes them actionable. But that's a theme that carries all the way through the group of folks that we have this morning here for the next 90 minutes or so, or maybe just under. To Matt's left is Catherine Nakalembe, also from University of, attached to the University of Maryland, but importantly, running the Africa program at NASA Harvest, an extraordinary institution that cuts across many different organizations, but all entirely focused on producing world-class information about global food security and insecurity and responding to disruptions in the global food system. To Catherine's left is Sean Askey, who's an engineering manager at Google and specifically has been intimately involved in advancing all of the work around Google Earth and all the ways in which those technologies radiate out to create value for the world. And then sitting next to Sean is Sarah Williams from MIT, who has a long and storied career creating remarkable data visualizations and other ways of leveraging data for creating lasting change for all kinds of constituencies, and whose work I've actually seen for years and years and years and really been enormously impressed by. So we have an amazing group of people, and I will add just a few opening things at the beginning, as we're going to spend most of our time today, I think, talking a little bit about what's new and where innovation is coming. But interestingly, a couple of us were at a dinner last night, and it was a really fascinating thing. All of the people involved in social change wanted to ask the technologists what was coming and what was next and what was going to break our brains in terms of capabilities. And all the engineers and design and technologists wanted to do was talk about all the complexity of applying those technologies in the world for lasting social change and all the complexities around building policies. So it was a really interesting conversation. And I think that theme is going to continue this morning as we have been discussing. There's a strong interest to sort of talk about really two things. One is the real complexities of what is happening and how to make lasting change. And I think to have a more free-form conversation with these leaders. If you don't mind, because I'm going to show a couple of slides, because I do want to check the box of actually giving you a sense of some of the things, that, at least in my part of the world, that we're actually developing. We have this enormous overpromise of a title for this session, Beyond the Cutting Edge, just into the realm of science fiction. But if you don't mind, I'm going to stand up and just say a few things, mostly because the clicker's over here. Actually, I can do it sitting down. So, I do want to say, people ask me sometimes what my job is. I work in an organization, I think many of you will know it, called Planet. We operate the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. They collectively image the Earth at between 3 and 5 meters daily for the entire terrestrial landmass and near oceans of the Earth. We make that data widely available for many different purposes, but especially the ones that bring us together in this room. So sometimes people ask me what my job is, and I have kind of two stock answers. The first one is that I babysit the world's least leveraged data set, because we have this immense amounts of capability now, and only a tiny percentage of the value of the data assets that we're producing has fully been leveraged for the world's benefit. The other thing that feels like on a daily basis is that I am a professional schizophrenic. And I don't know if you have this experience too, but I would share with you, it's a weird time to be a professional anything on planet Earth, inasmuch as the great problems that are in front of us seem to be big and getting bigger and running away from us. The intrinsic volatility of the world promises to disrupt what fragile progress we've made, even as the challenges we confront in terms of the loss of nature and ecocide or climate change seem to be accelerating past us. And yet, if we are in the first days of the sixth extinction of life on Earth, the sixth time in the history of life when biodiversity has collapsed, we're also living, it seems, through the second Renaissance, right? A radical expansion of capabilities and of technologies and of resources. So if you are an optimist, wow, this is a great time to be an optimist. I can show you all kinds of reasons for optimism. If you are a pessimist, I can give you all kinds of reasons for pessimism. And if you are simply experiencing vertigo and confusion, there's lots of evidence for that too. So it's just a really weird time to be in this and to be constantly experiencing the shearing forces of modernity, right, between the capabilities we have and the challenges we confront. That said, I want to give you just a couple of really quick reasons for optimism, and also a sense of some of the things we're working on. And this is not a pitch for Planet in any way. These are kind of generalized observations, but I have to use the examples that I know. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. The first thing that it seems really exciting to me about where the edge is moving is that the edge itself is moving because the circle of participation is radically expanding. We are seeing many more people engaged in and touched by the collective activities of using all of this data to drive social change. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we work on at Planet is what we call these things called planetary variables. These planetary variables are data sets that are derived data sets. One of them that we produce is a global comprehensive mapping continuously of soil moisture. And today, that data set is used to help ensure farmers and pastoralists in more than 28 countries around the world. And so we're starting to see new forms of social protection delivered to people who never need to think about, look at, or in any way come back to or consider or have capacity around using data. They just receive the benefits of the data. This is one of the ones I think is particularly interesting. We have now seen significant uptake of geospatial data by entities like the Polizia Federale. We have a really significant relationship with them. They are using geospatial indicators to look at changing patterns of land use and emergent tasks of deforestation, emergent deforestation. They have now, based on those signals, conducted more than 120 joint operations, joint raids with more than 3,800 agents. And they've seized more than 1,000 machines for doing deforestation, for the literally like burning, as you can see here, the tractors in the field, and collected more than $2 billion US equivalent from the organizations engaged in illegal deforestation. Now, that is a drop in the bucket of what's needed. We know that the situation, we heard yesterday from Matt and others, the situation is bad and that's not, it's not perfect. But there is something powerful about the ways in which these tools are being seamlessly embedded in the world. My favorite example of this is this one. This is from my home country in the United States. We were doing a survey of all the ways in which people are using geospatial data to drive agricultural practices, sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices. In particular, using geospatial data to help encourage rotational grazing practices among organic farmers. And I did not believe that there was anyone in the US doing this until I met this group of farmers who take geospatial data and they produce a guide, weekly guide for farmers who are organic dairy farmers, including this one. And I don't know if you can tell, the cow in the middle of that slide makes the actual milk that I actually pour on my actual Cheerios in the morning. So this is the other end of the dairy supply chain for my life. And this particular cow and her sistren, I think that's how you say that, they are moved rotationally through their plots using geospatial signals that are sent to this farmer and many others. And indeed, when the farmers can't receive that information by email because some of them are Amish, it's mailed to them a week in advance, and it sort of guides them through their practices. And again, these are not people looking at pixels. These are people getting the value from the work that they do. So these are hundreds and hundreds of these things coming along. And at the same time, the last thing I'll just say, and then we'll pivot to some other things. At the end of this, I'd like to show you some of what will be coming next, is that we continue to see the expansion of hundreds of new digital public goods, new digital assets that are designed to serve everyone equally. This is a particularly interesting one that we're working on with our colleagues at Microsoft and the Nature Conservancy, which is an homage to the work of WRI. It's called Global Renewables Watch. It's actually an open source continuous monitoring system for every renewable energy resource, utility grade renewable energy resource on Earth. It was announced at the United Nations General Assembly last September. It'll be available later this year in its full flower. Now, the reason I wanted to say this to you is that this is the positive side of that schizophrenia. This is the sense that there's really progress that's happening. At least these are the kinds of things that I get to see. I'm also aware of the enormous complexity that is required to deliver lasting social change, and to pick up on that theme that we heard from Crystal yesterday when she showed that fantastic diagram with projects on one side and impact on the other, and basically spaghetti in the middle. Right? We all live in the spaghetti. So I don't want to just be glib and say these things just happen by themselves. The folks we have here this morning are architects of how to deliver those kinds of impacts, and that's why I'm really excited to welcome all of them. So I've asked them each to speak for 5 or 6 minutes just to introduce themselves. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Then we'll open it up to a wider conversation. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Matt. Take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. No slides for me, which is like, maybe first time ever maybe, without a technology malfunction. But I just wanted to say that our goal is, I think policy is ahead of our capabilities. When they draw up carbon monitoring goals to calculate emissions and that sort of thing, you can write a theoretical framework, you can do the physical basis of it, and you can design the aspirational, let's say model, but the observations to do that are not off the shelf, nor are the methods. So I always feel like policy is a little bit ahead of our capabilities. We're trying to catch up to it. And I will tell you, we will probably never get to the point where we're counting, carbon atoms coming and going from pixels. We have to model at some point. We have to make a compromise. We have to deal with uncertainties. So I think that's when we're going from, and we start with research, we test methods, we see how far we can get, and in the end, we need to have something that goes into operations. So it's research to operations is still the mode to catch up with the policy objectives. And that's a very hard thing, I think. And we're at this point where we've got a lot of people in the domain making prototype products and demonstrating capabilities, but eventually we have to land on something that we can hand off to institutions and they can run with it. And this is a very difficult space to be in. So it's just, we're in a nice, it's a nice space in terms of, the excitement and the challenge around developing methods that will be operational, but we also know it's a really urgent need. We got to get the show on the road. And we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We need to find some answers and move forward. And so that's one thing. And when you talk about the cutting edge, it's a very exciting time to be in remote sensing to serve these policy objectives. When we talk about innovation, it could be incremental, it could be the paradigm shift. When we talk about AI, I immediately think of maybe they were going to come up with something that'll just blow us out of the water, and we will all have to start over from scratch because this new kind of approach has made us, totally made obsolete what we're doing right now. And I think more in innovation in incremental, or closer to incremental than paradigm shift. But when we're talking about the components of that in our space, we have computing. Computing is really the scale of the cloud, the ability to process every pixel in an archive. We have every pixel of Landsat, and now Sentinel-2 in the form of this HLS time series data in our lab, and we can query each pixel and build time series of land cover and land use dynamics. It's amazing. I mean, the first global map of the land surface in terms of land cover was from our lab. I just was hired in like 1994. I didn't make it. It was 180 pixels by 360 pixels, 1 degree spatial resolution. And you could almost hand draw it. And now we're dealing with 4-meter products with Planet global scale. So we've done this incredible advancement in about 30 years in terms of detail, both spatial and temporal. The volumes are incredible, but computing has really helped us do that. Now, when we have all that advanced computing, now we can, deep learning algorithms have been there, but it wasn't until we got the cloud that we could avail ourselves of the deeper layered neural networks that now allow us to do advanced computer vision and get us really excited about what else we can do in terms of characterizing the land surface. So in tandem with computing, our space technology has really improved as we go down in spatial resolution, and we add bands and that sort of thing. There's a nice constellation, literally, of options that we can use to map the land surface. But I will say one issue, and this is something that I talked to Andrew about a couple days ago, just prepping for this, is in the U.S., if you go below 10 meters, it's commercial, it's private. And so, NASA could build spatial details, constellations below 10 meters, but it is the domain of the private sector. It always has been. I think that's a legacy of DoD or whatever. It's not codified. I've asked USGS and others, like, is that a law? Well, nope. No, but if they propose a sensor, time series sensor, suite of sensors that are in that spatial domain, it will not, it's a non-starter. Why do I mention that? Because when you said the archive is least leveraged, that sounds like the Landsat archive before they made it free.
Right.
They used to say that about Landsat. They said the vast majority of Landsat images have never been looked at because you had to pay for them.
Right.
So it's a challenge to figure out how to get your data. The limit is really, we want more eyes on the data. We want, because if you're thinking about our big global challenges, we want to have as many creative minds looking at the data and testing out this AI and that thing. But if it's gate-kept on a cost model, obviously you have fewer eyes on the data. So I think that's a challenge. And the NICFI thing is a great example of, okay, we are now letting all the countries of the tropics, take a look at your data and see what they can get out of it. But I do think, in the big picture, that still is an issue, because in our time, the global environment it's the issue of our age, and it's unprecedented. All the graduating classes, they always say, you're going to face these challenges. They're facing a unique challenge that's never been faced by other graduating classes, and this is the issue that these data can help address. And I think the gatekeeping of it is it's an issue.
We'll get into it, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And then I think, I talk, as opposed to the cutting edge, there's the boring edge. The boring edge is getting to operational monitoring. We need the same thing done repeatedly over time in all these different institutions as they're monitoring their land assets. And each country could have their particular commodity crops that they need to do. We talked about, it's not one size fits all, but they have to have a generic, repeatable, boring capability. So it's no longer research. It's just done. And it's stable. In the remote sensing field, we always Landsat changes over time.
Right.
And when it changes, when you go from whisk broom to push broom, your signal to noise gets 15 times better. You actually are seeing different things, even at the same resolution. It's a 30-meter pixel, but I'm seeing a lot more with the push broom sensor. That means I have a step function in my sensitivity. I'm mapping something different. So, you know, I remember growing up, this is a weird one because I say this to students, but you'd watch the nightly news, it was the same weather picture every day. You know, weather is operational. We get the same data every day. We need to think like that with Lancet. I'm sorry, with the land. And I really do, like, Planet thinks globally. You got the global acquisitions. You got the, you know, it is very much like what I would advocate for in terms of monitoring it. You guys are awesome in terms of thinking at scale and repeatability. But I do think we need to have more consistent land observations that allow us to track consistently the dynamics of the Earth, and not play with technology so much. So there has to be a baseline capability, and as we add bells and whistles to that, man, let's just keep that baseline capability. Anyway, I've gone over my time a little bit, but there's a couple other thoughts there. But in general, it's a golden age. There's a big shakedown. It's a wide open field in terms of characterizing land surface and how we are changing it. But our ultimate goal is to quickly, somehow, move out of all of the fun experimental stuff into something that just is reliable and solves the top 5 problems that we need to be solved.
That's great. Catherine, over to you. And I know you here. Let's pass both of those things. There you go.
Thank you. I think my mic is on. I wanted to add to, you talked about the boring edge and the cutting edge. There's also the messy edge, which is transitioning, I think the slides are backwards actually. Transitioning from cutting edge or from research to operation is, I consider it as the messy edge. I'm just waiting for my slide to show. I'm Catherine Nakalembe of the University of Maryland, and I work under the NASA Harvest program, which is NASA's Agriculture for Security initiative, with a focus to move all the advances, all the technology, all the solutions from research into operation. Oh, there we go. So I think I missed a slide or something like that. Within Harvest itself, we have Africa activities, priorities that we've kind of set up. These come from work that we've already been doing, trying to leverage and improve monitoring systems, monitoring and early warning systems. Matt talked about the boring part, so these systems actually make that possible, the fact that they produce the same information in the same format that's accessible to end users. An example is the GLAM system that's been developed by the University of Maryland for a long time, trying to make sure that that is functional and it works and is accessible across, you know, really, really large landscapes. The other is advancing the methods. So we recognize that there's a lot of groups working in this particular space, developing cropland, crop type maps, or yield models. But we work on this specifically because sometimes our end users themselves want very specific things that might not be readily accessible, but we also want to be sure that we're using the best available and that's functional within their working environment. The other is capacity, so making sure that the tools can be transitioned, that they work, that people know how to actually use them, interpret the data, and if they want to try and produce things internally, they can do that themselves. And then partnerships, there's just too much stuff going on. There's a lot of development across just the technology space, but as well as in terms of you know, funding and resources, as well as accessing data. For example, having access to some of the planet data that's been mentioned allows us to be able to generate cropland maps across different places where we don't have on-ground data. So this is sort of like our overarching kind of framework. We are trying to build user-centric systems. Matt mentioned this, incremental advances. We don't want things that completely overhaul things that we've invested in a really long time. So taking advantage of existing data, Matt's mentioned this as well, and then trying to make sure that the products we produce are high quality and are accessible and somebody can use them, and they can work within, for example, policy documents. So if I can understand how agriculture production has been changing in my country over the last couple of years, my country, not somebody else telling me about it, I can, for example, advocate for specific changes. If something is not working in a region and I understand how that region functions, perhaps I could suggest different ways to approach it. But ultimately, you want this information accessible to the farmer, like what Andrew showed at the beginning. So how can a farmer use it? This is the other messy spaghetti space. And so what we're building, I did mention this, is that it's what we're continuing to do is sort of inspired and motivated by some work that we've already done, working with different end users across different countries, contributing to different projects that have been impactful in different countries. And then one of the things that kind of drives trying to do a little bit more, for example, last year we've been working on this regional food balance sheet as an initiative to work in 6 countries to provide information on crop production. So that required almost creating a whole other workflow that allows us to use things we've tested to be able to fit into this food balance sheet, providing production forecasts. So I want to show one example of something that we've invested in a lot to develop a cropland, hopefully crop type maps if we can address the data gaps, is this pipeline, which is open access. Matt said we need more voices, more eyes on data, and we need more voices and more eyes on very complicated systems that make it possible to do really cool research or science and then translate that into application. So this pipeline is an open source pipeline that allows you to process data, test different machine learning models, and then create maps, evaluate them, try to iterate. And it's not perfect, it's still work in progress, especially because we're trying it in very, very complicated agriculture systems. But it's something that we are investing in. And these are some maps that we've developed across Africa. We're also trying it in other countries and in other regions. And most recently, we've been working on Maui in the United States as a way of evaluating its transferability, replicability, as well as functionality in a different geography. So I did mention we want to get to crop type maps, which are useful for obviously, if you want to do crop-specific area, you want to do crop type. You want to create crop type maps. This is very, very complicated in smallholder agriculture. It might not even be possible given mixes of crops, among other things. But one of the biggest limitations is the availability, accessibility of training data required to do that. If you want to do it continuously, be it every 5 years, you'd have to do very large-scale data collection on the ground. So our solution is not really a solution. One is try to access data that have been collected and standardize them so we can use them within our own pipeline. So we've been developing this crop harvest data set, and we include other people's data that we're collecting ourselves, and it's also public, and continuously add to it. And other things that we're doing, particularly in this space, is working with our end users. So extension agents across all the different countries we're working, we train them on how to collect data using different apps, and also trying to come up with really cool, smart ways, including using GoPro cameras to collect street-level images that later on we process into crop type labels. And we ultimately believe that once we publish this data set, we will have over 1 million crop type labels. Hopefully they'll be great because we have over 6 million images across 7 different countries. And we're trying to get that and make that available to the public so others can actually look at the data and work with it. And that is my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That's great. I have many questions for you about this work. Over to you, Sean.
Great. So I'm actually a newcomer to the practice of remote sensing. Since joining Google in 2007, I've focused most of my time helping people in humanitarian and environmental fields use Google Earth to map their projects, visualize data, and to tell their stories. And I later became the engineering lead for Google Earth and focused my team on bringing collaborative, cloud-based map making and storytelling to a much wider audience. So I kind of consider myself more of a map maker than an Earth observation expert, but I still bring this lens of everyday people who need simple tools and simple solutions for their challenges. That said, I have sat within shouting distance of the Earth Engine team since before they began. And I think I picked up a little bit by osmosis. Was there to see a lot of the early successes with Matt in the early days, and saw how they ushered in this new era of planetary scale computing for Earth observation by overcoming these once insurmountable computing scaling challenges. And many of you here today either use or benefit from the global scale processing that you can do with tools like Earth Engine or Planetary Computer. With these capabilities, this community is creating globally consistent data sets and monitoring systems for our most critical landscapes and ecosystems. And tools built on Earth Engine, Planetary Computer, and other solutions are informing policy. They're helping with tracking and reporting of progress. I like this example. Before UNEP and JRC worked with us to produce the SDG 661 app, only about 20% of countries had the ability to monitor their freshwater. After putting this together, about 160 countries were able to directly report their official SDG progress directly through the tool. So needless to say, I got really interested in landscape mapping. I'm here, obviously, and recently switched to the team that produced Dynamic World. And Dynamic World is our open model and open data stream that provides per class land cover probabilities for individual Sentinel-2 images. It's a new way of thinking about and working with land cover data. And I think there's still a lot of untapped potential there, looking for signals and patterns in those probabilities and unlocking new ways of using that data set. We're also really eager for people to crack open the model itself, play with it and adapt it. I think that's kind of another untapped opportunity if you're looking for things to play with. My team leverages a lot of machine learning and a lot of deep learning. We recently published a paper about a novel video-based method for cloud and shadow detection and removal. And we're looking forward to bringing it to bear to provide clear inputs for the works of this community, as well as improving the quality of Dynamic World. So I feel like I'm finally getting a crash course on Earth observation, on machine learning. And while I still have a fresh and probably naive perspective, I wanted to share what I see as one of the biggest gaps and opportunities in this space, and it's top of mind for me. And it's one that I keep hearing about again and again in various sessions here in this conference. So cloud computing has helped alleviate the challenges of accessing data and computation at scale. But that level of access has really outpaced the expertise and the organizational capacity needed to actually use Earth observation for a lot of the places where it's needed. You still need a PhD to do a lot of this work. I took an Earth Engine class for the first time in December, and though I know how to program, I was kind of dismayed at the amount of esoterica and toil that was involved in just doing a simple random forest land cover classification. You're removing clouds, you're building your composites, you're adding indices, you're normalizing them, you might be doing PCA, data separation, model training, accuracy assessments, finding mislabeled training data. Like, it's kind of a nightmare, to be honest. I'm impressed that this community puts up with that as much as they do. And I know this is remote sensing 101, right? But this is also a 101 meter tall wall for anyone else that wants to get into this space. And so I think tearing down that wall, or thinking about tearing down that wall, is the big opportunity that I see. So in order to realize a lot of the big changes that we need to see in the realms of climate and protection, our methodologies have to be adapted and applied at scale to local context, local needs, and local realities for those decision makers and sustainability implementers on the ground. But this prospective audience, I think, is a lot bigger than this nerd fest of a community will ever be able to address directly. This community is creating global models, monitoring systems that are critical for a top-down perspective, for measurement planning, and for transparency. But what if these solutions aren't meeting the bespoke needs and the bottom-up needs of people on the ground who don't have access to a PhD? Meeting those needs might require additional local contextualization, more granular classification, incorporation of local data sets, critically, maybe higher spatial and temporal resolution. And so to be a bit provocative, my question is, why should anything other than a good understanding of the land and ability to create a training set necessary to create locally accurate, locally actionable landscape maps or monitoring systems. Can we empower people by orders of magnitude to do this work in a scientifically valid way without requiring a PhD? Can we generalize and productionize our vetted methodologies to meet these bespoke needs at scale? I think AI has a role potentially to play in this. Things like deep learning coupled with low-shot training, something I think, Catherine, you had talked about in some of your papers. Machine vision on high-resolution imagery, seamless, easy offline field data collection, generating outputs that are actually useful for people and their everyday workflows. I mean, I love a good, sexy, interactive map. A lot of people just need a simple chart, a simple graph, and you still need a PhD or a GIS experience to extract those type of insights from raw geospatial data and analyses. And then, most of all, you need to integrate these capabilities into the tools that they're already using. There are way too many tools out there already. There are tools for tracking tools, and I think focusing on capabilities and making them reusable and injectable into existing solutions is the way to go. So, for me, I think this requires us to look beyond the specific goals and outputs of our current projects and methodologies, and think about how we can truly operationalize and mobilize Earth observation for a much larger audience. I would love to build these kind of tools if that's useful. If that's a terrible idea, please tell me. I'd love to hear that. If it's a great idea, I'd love to hear from you even more. And yeah, otherwise I'm kind of curious who would like to help.
Thanks so much, Sean. We're going to come back to this theme in particular about this moment of how much capacity you need in your organization, in yourself, actually, to use these kind of tools in a few minutes. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really excited to see the projects that you guys have shown. For those of you who were here yesterday at the plenary session, I thought Crystal's call to how do we take data really to impact is something that my work represents. And I thought I would tell a story today of a project where I did that all the way through as an example of how we can talk about some of this great data sets that you guys have been making available. So, sharing data, I think, is essential for communicating the need for policy change and generating the debate essential for that work. And data visualizations are an effective way to do that. I also think sharing data, like the way that you guys are sharing data, is super important, but not everyone can take that data and create insights from it. So in a project that I worked on with the World Food Program and the Migration Policy Institute, the Organization of American States, we collected data from 5,000 Guatemalan, Honduras, and El Salvador households to understand the issue of migration, why they're migrating, questions about remittances, and so forth. And together, we produced a report, the kind that was traditionally made by both the World Food Program and the Migration Policy Institute. But as we were putting this report together, creating the insights, we felt like this report the message wasn't getting across. The issue of migration has been contentious for years. We know it's a big issue with climate change, and we felt like the insights weren't being activated. So for a November 2021 congressional hearing and release of the report, the World Food Program took a leap of faith and allowed us to create a website and visualization that we presented at the hearing. And because it was during Zoom, we actually put the visualization and website in the Zoom link and allowed congressmen to interact with the data. The website contextualized the work in the larger historical framework. And it should come as no surprise to this group that the number of refugees and asylum seekers from the northern countries in Central America has soared in the past 5 years. And studies show that food security, violence, climate variability are factors for people's reasons to leave. One of the biggest insights of the report was the sheer financial burden which migrants take on. If you can believe it, people from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador spent close to $2.2 billion to migrate just in 2021. Yet the US benefits the most from the migrants entering our agricultural labor force. In fact, 73% of the US labor force is made up of migrants. And this 2.2 billion number is close to the same that the US Department of Homeland Security spent to apprehend Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Hondurans at the border. So you can see this kind of cross-working in terms of funding and issues. And while migrants take on all of the risks, only 57 make it to their final destination. Yet both countries benefit. Many migrants send remittances back home. And in fact, we found that in El Salvador, 25% of their GDP is coming from the money being received from migrants abroad. And it's usually thought that remittances go to extras, adding a road or a house. Our study found that remittances are actually going to sustain life, basic needs, putting food on the table, putting clothes. These remittances are acting as a social service in this country, and this is where kind of there's a symbiotic benefit. And so it may come as no surprise that we found that financial insecurity motivates migrants the most, and that most migrants don't want to leave their country. And this tapestry of motivations from economics, family reunification, security, climate change, and quality of life are the main reasons that migrants from all economics levels leave. And so one of the things that we found through the data is that it's not just the lowest income classes, but all classes are leaving driven by these kind of multifaceted motivations. Ultimately, our findings recommended that the US government create more legal channels for Central American migrants. It's cheaper and safer for the migrants, and it puts the risks, it removes the extreme risks that the migrants take on. And this is exactly what 33 senators recommended to the Department of Homeland Security in the Biden administration just months after our congressional hearing. We were very excited when Biden in June of 2022 announced more legal pathways for migrants from Central America. So just to give you an example, we have lots of legal passage for Mexican migrants, but the same kind of visas are not allocated for Central American migrants. And since we did this visualization, I wanted to go back and ask the people at the congressional hearing, like, what role did, and why did they make these recommendations? And so we interviewed them. And one of the things that they said is that being able to interact with the data and the visualization allowed them to create their own insights while I was talking to them, to understand the data and actually come up with their own connection to the information that they were seeing. And that connection that they made through these interactive data visualizations allowed them to share new insights within their recommendations to the Biden administration. And so it's how we can really learn from data visualization. So this is how I think we can take data to action. We need to build expert teams. So one of the things that was really important here is working with the World Food Program, working with the Migration Policy Institute, working with my team who are data visualizers and experts, collecting data uniquely. We went out into the field, quantifying that data uniquely, coming up with some of these insights, and then ground truthing that data. We worked very closely with migrant communities to kind of assess whether our information, and then opening that data up through visualization so that people can contextualize, and then kind of creating another round through those edits. And I hope all of you can think about the way that you can take your data to action.
That's great. Thanks so much. I hope you can see why our hosts were so thoughtful in bringing this particular group together. But I also hear in this discussion, in your remarks, a couple of different tracks. We have a whole set of clustering constellation of questions around what do we actually need to scale. Like, for instance, Catherine, I heard you talk about the need for training data and for ground truth data. And Sarah, you mentioned it in your circular diagram just a second ago. And there's I think a lot of conversation about not only how do we collect that information, but how do we collect it in a way that's ethical, equitable, that returns value to those that contribute it, that allows participation in the onward streams of its creation. And no doubt, I mean, if I didn't work at Planet and had to leave tomorrow, I think this is the problem I'd actually most want to work on, because it feels like it's the thing that most holds us back in many ways. So maybe start with, I'll start with Catherine, and then Sarah, I'll come to you about how you think about that problem. And I'm particularly interested, Catherine, I'll ask you this. We don't have gold standard ground truth data collection methodologies, it seems to me. We're repurposing a lot of old data in trying to train these models. What are you paying attention to? What do you see in the realm of the need for this kind of ground truth data? Are there practices or programs or projects that you think are getting it right? How do we fill the gap?
I think we have, I would say there are like standardized ways to collect data. There are, definitely ways to stratify and plan and be able to collect data anywhere. The cost will vary depending on where you're collecting it. So, if you're driving your SUV in the US and you stop by a field, it's kind of pretty straightforward. But if you have to hike, over rivers and, climb over stuff to end up at a crop field, it's a little bit different. If you're harvesting crops with a combined harvester versus you have to cut out the maize and weigh it, it's like a very different thing. But I think it's the value of what you will use that data, that is probably not really well understood. And in many cases, a lot of attempts and efforts are really, really short term. So there are lots of examples of projects and initiatives to fill a data gap. It's usually 1 year competition, people try it everywhere and they do it, but then there won't be a follow-on. And so you could set up your great sampling strategy and have a very great sample, go out and do it, like do the very best, climb over everything and get the data. But then you won't be able to do it next year or in 2 years or in 3 years' time. And so fundamentally from within the landscapes where I'm primarily focused, like working, for example, in Eastern Africa or in Mali, I wouldn't be able to continuously collect data at the scale that needs to be if I'm looking at, for example, crop type or yield, because it costs so much money. And one of those solutions, obviously, is to try and work with government institutions, because they have extension agents everywhere. You can train, extension agents collect these types of data. They can use a phone just like everybody. They can enter information. The form can be in multiple languages. We've done a little bit of this in Mali, where we have it in French, English, Bambara, and you can add other languages. So they can follow instructions, collect data. We've collected pretty good data. The problem is when you do it within a project, you have this like period where there is funding to go and pursue this particular question at that particular time. But then next year, the institution that has to benefit the most from the output from those data doesn't have the funding to be able to do it. And so then there's like this huge break. So I've had collected data in Tanzania in 2014, and then again in 2023, and then you collect data in a very small region in Tanzania. You find in Kenya, for example, there are like multiple teams collecting data in multiple places, everybody following their own methodology. And so ultimately, that doesn't solve the problem of where what is growing in Kenya.
Gotcha.
And how is it going, you know, basically.
Let me come to Matt and then over to Sarah.
Yeah, training data is a great topic. It is not, generically speaking, the answer. You need really good training data for any theme. And in addition to targeting your theme of interest, you need the affinity classes that are confused with that. So if you're training even on water, you need to know all of the things out in the environment that look like water that are not. And, you know, for example, Midtown Manhattan looks like water in optical data. So you have to know where all of the confounding features are in the landscape that are a problem. So in crop type, if you're going to look for maize, you better find sorghum, and you need to say sorghum is not maize. So you have to really think about your subset very clearly and kind of put you're trying to put a discrimination, a bounding box around that theme. And in certain themes, once you do that, you can prove possibly that this is not, you cannot discriminate this thing. So for small grains, you might be able to make a cereals map, but you can't make a barley map because it's not separable. And there's a bunch, in our experience, short woody vegetation. I mean, we have yet to be able to map it. I think smallholder ag, low intensity ag is the biggest challenge because when you have a smallholder clear, you know, a Miombo woodland and put in a crop, you're seeing a lot of soil. It's less green than the vegetation, the natural vegetation that it replaced. And you're trying to identify what is that crop in there. Maybe they're doing multiple cropping, like in Yucatan, it's beans, squash, and corn on limestone outcrops.
Right.
What are you going to map with that? So this, you know, you got to be very intimate with your landscape. You have to go out and get all the training data. You have to run your arm. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And you have to aggregate to some more general level. And maybe I'm just going to do greenness over cropland as opposed to crop type.
Let me have you hold that thought. And Sarah, maybe you want to weigh in. I'm curious about the ways in which you collect the data for your initiative. And the way you think about the kind of social and ethical aspects of the data collection.
Yeah, I mean, obviously AI has huge social and ethical, I mean, we forget about all of the labor that produces our AI models and the mass amount of training data. And I think that in my work, you know, kind of thinking about AI practices is how to make sure that the workers are treated fairly and justly, which is, I think, really important. I think in my own work, I'm really interested in this missing data in a larger extent, right? Like you guys are talking about missing training data. I think one thing that we forget is there's just missing data in general, population information, birth and death data, and data on the built environment. So I work really hard with local communities to develop those kind of data sets in order to build skills as well. I've been doing a lot of work in Nairobi, working in Kibera to kind of develop maps there, and a lot of the people that we're working with are now working for the Census Bureau and others, so also using the idea of how do we develop training data into something that can turn into skills and jobs for the people that are working on it. So my interest in like kind of creating this missing data is how can we use the creation of this data to also elevate the skills and levels of the people that we're working with, to give them new kinds of job training and access to kind of new fields as well.
That's great. Hey, guys in the booth, could I ask you to bring my slides back up for just a second? Because there's something I want to share with us, and actually I've talked to Sean about a little bit. But I'm particularly interested in this, you know, for all of us in this room who are in our, you know, this moment in our careers. Oh, can I have the clicker back? all comes rolling back. I was going to show you a bunch of futuristic stuff, but I want to just show you one really quick example of some things that we're starting to see that really are at the edge. And then I'm going to ask you, Sean, to maybe elaborate a little bit from your position at Google. But so let me see if I can go through here. So I'm just going to skip all this, all brilliant, amazing stuff. And I just want to show you, oh, here, can I go back? Okay, so I want to show you a little demonstration of something that we at Planet have been building with our colleagues at Microsoft. And in particular here, what we're doing is we're taking some of these derivative products, these things where we're identifying soil moisture and we're looking at the kind of indices, the NDVI, simple stuff for most of the people in this room, and overlaying them, in this case, on a map of California, and really taking these classified systems in which we're classifying and characterizing what's happening on the surface of the Earth, and taking that very structured data and marrying it to these large language models like ChatGPT, these kinds of things that you've been hearing a lot about. So here is just a really quick demo of this in California, in which you can see me zooming in and asking questions, in this case, about what's happening in a particular city in this happens, I can't read it on the screen, but I think this is Sacramento. And we're asking questions about what's happening with the land surface temperature in plain English, and just running this visualization in real time to show how the algorithm is actually thinking about that question, and then giving us back answers and allowing us to ask complex, plain English, natural language questions about the Earth in real time. And in that context, what we're seeing is really a couple things here that are interesting. One is, I think about this in the context of Google. And if we think about what made Google Google, this is maybe back at the very beginning, right? The first thing that Google did is it indexed the internet. And then it put that index behind the world's easiest to use and ultra-simplified user interface. And then it interposed an economic model between the person asking the question and the index giving it the answer back. And when you put those three things together, you get an incredibly world-changing enterprise. It seems to me like the entire time of our time in this field has been really the kind of library science, GIS, PhD era of using this kind of remote sensing questions. And it leads us inexorably to this view of the world in which if you are living in the library science era, if you develop a very sophisticated tool, you had better have a librarian or someone with a PhD around who can actually answer the questions. Then you end up with a situation where capacity to use the data dramatically accelerates, is dramatically surpassed by just the data itself, which is, I think, the point you were making, that availability is outstripping expertise. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, now, right, we might be in a moment where that chapter is coming meaningfully to an end. It might be the case. I mean, we certainly are going to continue to need the kinds of things that Matt and Catherine and colleagues are producing, but we might be in this era of the search barification of all of our work. And in that opportunity, I think, the circle might expand really dramatically. We saw this was put together in a matter of a few weeks. There are very serious efforts at every enterprise, including, I imagine, Google's, based on things that Rebecca was sharing. Lots and lots of really powerful things coming here. So I wanted to get you to respond to that as an idea, and kind of like, not as a specific, this is coming next week, but as a secular trend. What do you see? And am I full of shit? Is this totally off base, and am I over-promising and being a Silicon Valley hypester?
Matt's going to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. When we first started back in 1994 with our first global map, we would deliver the data as a flat binary on an FTP site. Right. And the only way you could look at it was on a hard copy print in a journal. Right. And so, the Google Earth apps were like this epiphany that all of a sudden you can pan and zoom in real time, individual pixels, continents, and interact with our data. And we still wear out the apps. The app, all of our data goes up on there. This is crazy too, though. This is next level. I love this idea that, because even when I get to the point where like I need to start making some graphs per country trend on deforestation rates, I got to do a lot of heavy lifting. So if you had natural language driven, I just want to know what is the trend of deforestation in Bolivia. I just type that in, and you get some graphical feedback. It's awesome. So I love it. But go ahead.
Sean, please. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be the future. I think there's a lot of due diligence to do to make sure that you're tying back answers to reality and facts and able to attribute, where these answers are coming from. And I think that's where a lot of the hard work comes from. I was chatting with someone yesterday about using ChatGPT to write Earth Engine code and write the GUI code that they didn't like to deal with. And I think, when that comes from another service and you got to tweak it and you got to fix some of the errors, like your expectations are appropriate. I think if we're going to put the search box and write half the code for your Earth Engine app or answer these questions, like we got to get it right. You know? And so I think that's where a lot of the focus is at Google, and I think where we would need the focus for an application like that is just really clearly linking that natural language response to how we came up with it, sound methodologies, et cetera. And so I think there's going to be some meaty work to do there. But I agree. I think making these types of insights accessible to a much larger audience, if we can do that well, is really going to break open a lot of this Earth observation insight space that's currently behind locked doors.
It's behind code walls, I think, as you described, which I think is really interesting. And Sarah, I was particularly interested in something you said sort of glancingly that made me think about this in particular, which is that what the data visualization allowed was for the staff or the congressional staffers to kind of come up with their own hypotheses, ask their own questions, develop their own kind of sense of the texture of the data. And I will say, in the work that we're doing here, just for what it's worth as a down payment on what's coming, there's kind of two big structured problems in the AI space that we see clustering. We're doing a lot of work on this right now. One of them is just the hard work of making science-grade, high-quality, geospatially and temporally explicit indicators that you can trust, that are foundational, high-quality data, like the data sets that were just released yesterday, as part of the annual work, as part of all, if NASA tells you that it's happening, it had better be happening, right? There's a level of curation but that's all about building the structured intermediate layers that move from the baseline data sets to something that's sort of a higher order structure. Then there's this other piece, which is the generative piece, right? The generative AI piece. The thing so this doesn't go away. In fact, it only becomes more important, right? The generative AI piece seems to add two flavors, which I think are interesting. The first one is about this accessibility and queryability. I want to be able to ask questions that are really driven by my own hypothesis making and sense making activity. But the other one that's really intriguing and has been genuinely novel for us is we have talked a lot as a community for a long time about predictive analytics, about predictive models. And the thing about these generative models is that they are a hair's breadth difference between generative and predictive. Because if you think about like what a large text model does, it's sort of, it's sometimes been described as sort of autocomplete on steroids, right? You give it a prompt, it's going to give you a response to that prompt that tries to predict what the appropriate next round of things are to say. Well, if you feed it with a very dense time series data set, like all the data sets that you've got now in your shop, we're beginning to think that we might be able to say, okay, given the entire historical pattern of classified acts of deforestation, show me where the frontier of deforestation is going to go automatically, right? And do it in a way that is grounded in all this. Now, it'll come with error bars, right? No question. But there's something really intriguing there where, in addition to accessibility, we might get predictiveness that sort of rides shotgun alongside of it. And that's an intriguing hypothesis. It still needs to be proven out, but that's really where I think a lot of the edge discussion is coming. So we have about 20 minutes left. This is your chance now, I think, to ask some questions of this august group. Well, I can keep going and we can dig into some of the other aspects of this, but if there are questions in the audience or reflections, we'd love to hear them. And I think we have a person with a microphone back there, so if you are interested and feeling brave.
I wanted to make one quick comment.
Please.
Oh, over here.
And can you tell us who you are?
Andrew Cassidy.
On the stage.
On the stage.
Oh, sorry. I saw someone with a microphone over there, and I thought they were talking. Sorry. Hi,
I
Catherine.
just want to say one quick comment, relating to having people have access to information and data, being able to interpret it and use it in the context for what they want to do. So one of the initial initiatives that University of Maryland, which has sort of been integrated into the Harvest program, is this GeoGlam crop monitors, Group 1 Earth Observations crop monitors. And these are a really good example of, initially they were started as sort of a global initiatives with high-level organizations, for example, World Food Program, FAO, utilizing Earth observations for monitoring, and then it's sort of like integrated and then collaborative and then report on a country, for example. But customizing these and make them work at the national level and have national analysts use the same process, access the same data, understand how that platform works, and they control it, basically changed so many things. So one of the very first ones that we worked on was Tanzania, and them being able to sit and agree with them, as a team without, I'm going to use the word outside interference or intentions or motivations or, but they're following, kind of a set workflow that access the same high quality data as somebody from the World Food Program. And then being that they control this process, enable them to start to publish this bulletin that they've continued to publish, that they feel, it is their own product. And this, translates into it being taken to the minister and then being reported on, going further down the line. So I just wanted to say that having these accessibility, so having platforms that allow people to access information, similar to Global Forest Watch is another example. Ministries being able to look at how pixels are changing so quickly in their forests, for example, and integrating it into whatever reporting mechanism they have is really, really powerful. And the fact that they understand and can visualize and have people they trust, an analyst in the Ministry of Agriculture who doesn't have a PhD, is really, really powerful. It's much more powerful coming from that analyst than coming from me, providing an update of here's the status of your forest, I just wanted to kind of make that point.
I think that's such an important point because I think it's that collaborative process that really does take the data into policy action, right? So that they're interpreting, they're working with the data, they actually created the insights, their embedded knowledge, and they're including their embedded knowledge about place that maybe isn't in the data set itself, which I think is so useful and helpful. So these kinds of tools that allow you to access data in this way really can help create a huge impact.
I think it's really interesting. Democracy is the most one of the most under-leveraged innovations we have. There is a real difference between making accurate data and making trusted data. And we think about things like GFW and its enormous heritage. It's not just that it's the right information, it's that it's normatively assumed to be correct by all of these actors. And obviously there are going to be people who argue at the edges, but the important thing is like the ecosystem of trust, I think is the innovation as much as the actual content. I did see a question over here, so could you say hello and introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name's Gemma from Rainforest Action Network. Yes, I want to touch on this issue of trust and the issue of gatekeeping of data. A lot of the companies we've campaigned on, we've negotiated policies with, have made these deforestation commitments. They're about to start making claims around progress towards implementing those commitments. But at the moment, a lot of the claims are based on internal monitoring systems behind closed doors, like the black box monitoring approach of putting money into a service provider and getting the answers they want. So I guess my question is almost like a challenge around how do we break down the black box approach that the companies are hiding behind, and ultimately how do we get to a place where an organisation like myself or communities on the front line in Indonesia can actually look at the claims being put out by a Unilever or a Nestle and really make a determination of, is that claim accurate? Can it be trusted, or is that company still involved in the expansion into their territories? So thank you.
A great question. Who would like to, anyone want to start?
I mean, one of at the core of the work that I do is building trust in data and data collection processes. So one of the ways that I try to do that is like include the stakeholders in the process all along the way so that they understand, maybe they're not always engaged or care, but they've been informed, and that transparency in process is important. The other thing I try to do is use, again, data communication to demystify the algorithms that we're using. And so I didn't show any here, but a lot of the projects where we're using algorithms, we try to show, okay, in this particular pixel, that is why that's why this value came up in a way that you don't have to be a data scientist. And I think kind of I'm trying to unblack box the data, right, in a way so that people can see, okay, these are the kinds of inputs that went in to create this result in this location. And I find what's really exciting about doing something like that is that it starts new conversations. Oh, you put this in that way. Oh, okay, but maybe you might want to edit it this way, and it actually improves our product by doing that as well. So. But being transparent in that way, and this kind of transparency allows to build trust in data. And I think if we don't have trust in data, it's not usable.
Maybe a quick kind of response from me is making, going back to the platforms that allow accessibility, with the best available product, at highest, best resolution, accessible to organizations that are interested in providing alternative information to the black box. So if a company, one thing I think about always is like with insurance companies, like with crop insurance companies, they have something that they run in the back that determines how much people should be paid, right? And they pay who is supposed to be paid, for example. If there is an organization that might be your organization that is interested in supporting the communities specifically, and your organization has access to the best available, that could kind of report on what is fact versus whatever it is that's been reported, and adds this layer of accountability, I think is really important. It's the same thing even with the crop monitors that I mentioned before. Countries report based on the information they have available, the context, and the data that they've received. So will the World Food Program, so will FAO. And so if information is contradictory, then this brings a discussion of actually what is really happening, and that's like part of the crop monitor process. And so in a case for for forests, if there is some nefarious things going on and behind closed doors in a black box somewhere, empowering those organizations that are interested in presenting facts and making it possible for them to access the actual information, factual information, and them having a platform, obviously, to share it and change something, I think is one way to go about it.
Yeah. I have something I'd love to share, but I want to make sure, Matt, do you want to hop in on this one?
I find that comment really frustrating. I don't know, it's maddening. I don't know the answer, but an independent audit, it's like if they're untrustworthy, they're untrustworthy. Transparency is everything, and if they're not being transparent, you have to go around them.
You know, I will tell you this on this one question, this is one of the spaces where I have the greatest level of optimism. Because, first of all, everyone should have, you know, your skeptometer, your bullshitometer should be set to very high levels of calibration when people are making claims, no doubt. But I really believe that an era of radical climate transparency, I mean, by which I mean truly deeply transparent and the kind of shared transparency that drives effective action and accountability is right, it's literally being birthed right now. Could you guys put the slides up again just for a quick second? Because I'll show you something that, just to sort of validate that point, we'll see if they can bring them up. Yeah, here, let me go back for a second. So, you know, this is a forthcoming technology. It'll be rolling out in the next year or so. And Planet's not the only entity. This is one of the next major components of our constellation, but there are other companies and other actors that are engaged here. This is a forthcoming fleet of hyperspectral satellites called tanagers. We name all of our satellites for birds. We have doves, which orbit, you know, image the whole Earth every day. We have pelicans, which are going to zoom into 30 centimeter super high resolution, you know, 30 times a day anywhere on Earth. And then we have these hyperspectral instruments. There's something interesting here, just to quickly mention, that these instruments are a joint effort between Planet, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA's JPL, a suite of private climate philanthropists, and a number of other strategic NGO and technical partners, and the state of California. Now, the thing that these instruments do that's really interesting is that they, among many other things, in their first canonical use case, will be to do direct point source emissions detections of methane emissions in the atmosphere. So when you overlay, you know, methane on a molecule by molecule basis, vastly more impactful than CO2, but clearly really critical as part of this will also work on CO2 in the atmosphere. And when you overlay the optical data and these methane detections, we can literally say it's that cattle processing plant, it's that oil and gas pad, it's that you know, particular facility, it's that building. Now, why is the state of California interested in that? Because if you can take the cost of detecting methane emissions from thousands of dollars to literal, you know, single unit dollars, you can make the cost of ignoring those detected methane leaks incredibly expensive, right? You can build new kinds of policy accountability. So yes, we want to know if they're keeping their promises when they put them in their annual report, but the thing we'd really like to do is make them change their behavior when we detect that it's occurring way before, regardless of when the annual report comes out, right? You want to build those kinds of feedback loops. And one of the things that's particularly interesting, and I think it's a harbinger of many things to come, is that there's a separate institution called Carbon Mapper that's been set up, a nonprofit, that then takes receipt of those indicators as a public good so that they can drive climate justice and effective environmental justice action for many different kinds of actors. That is to say, they start with the technologists, but then they don't sit with the technologists, they move on to the other places. And the other thing I'll just mention is that these instruments, and one of my colleagues who's here, Max, she's going to be giving a talk on this later today, if any of you are interested on the capacities of this hyperspectral imaging. The other thing that they do that's incredibly powerful in their 420 spectral bands is that they are very good at detecting some key aspects of flora biodiversity at scale. Now, these are relatively low resolution pixels. They're like 30-meter pixels, but they give you a much more textured understanding of the kind of structure of ecosystems and habitats. And so I think they're going to be profoundly important for places where we want to do carbon and nature at the same time in a way that isn't related to or driven by the black box reporting standards of any particular enterprise. That is to say, you know, we're going to see those two things eventually converge, right? Because while you might be able to use your particular methodology and have your particular considerations, they will ultimately have to cohere with what we see about physics. So that's really exciting. Oh, you can turn this off, guys. I appreciate that. Any other questions or reactions? There's a question here, please.
Lou Vercio from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. I'm curious about the generative AI and the possibility of predicting deforestation. And if we look at what's really interesting to predict in deforestation, it's inflection points. And these inflection points often come from sometimes economic signals, but oftentimes governance signals, which are a bit outside of our experience. So that, there are sometimes surprises. Governments say we're going to do this, and it doesn't happen, or it does happen. Are we going to be able to use AI to reinforce it and generate more inflection points and actually anticipate what are real inflection points and what are likely not to be inflection points, so we can add pressure on the political processes, the economic processes to really bring about the types of changes we're looking for?
Yeah. If I knew that answer with 100% certainty, I would be running the Zolly Earth Fund and delegating billions of dollars to philanthropy out of my own pocket. Because it is a really good question, and I would really love to hear Sean and others react to it. But I want to just say one thing we've started to notice, which is that what's happening, like I described to you, that we're creating structured data products about the Earth. Well, we're seeing people do the same activity, but they're doing structured data products about all the world's financial documents. For instance, Bloomberg is doing a structured, like a finance GPT, right? And it might be the case that the signal about where that tipping point occurs doesn't exist in the Earth data set by itself, but it exists at the confluence of several of those sort of big structured data sets that are now within a sort of common API ecosystem, where what you're doing is saying, I want to pull together social data, and I want to pull together, World Bank data and finance data and planetary, not planet, but some planetary, structured data about the Earth, to try to find the signal might be when it's in two of those other data sets that it suggests where it might occur geospatially. There's a lot of that's going to be happening. Other thoughts?
I don't know if I have any great insights on the prediction side of things. I think what comes to mind for me is some of the ethical considerations there, right? Like, you're making predictions, you're going to change people's behavior. Whose behavior are you changing? Who has access to the data? And so that's kind of an area that, were I to dive into that, I'd really want to understand what are the risks, right? I mean, yes, it would be fantastic to predict deforestation, right? Who gets their hands on that data and decides they're going to go deforest somewhere else as a result, right? Or you're going to actually enable conflicting parties to, do good out. So I think there's some concerns I have there. I'd love to hear what other people think about that, the risks involved with prediction. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think we still have the problem that we had, in the 60s and 70s when we were trying to do these predictive models, which is exactly what you bring up, is how do you account for the changing dynamics of policy, human interaction, what you're discussing, right? Like how the prediction actually changes our interaction with the data. And I think these are questions that have been in computation and optimization for a long time. I think when we think about predictive futures, I think what's useful is like creating multiple scenarios that when you do attempt to make these optimization models, that you project 20 or 30 different futures, right? Like allowing people to understand that like a small variation can create a very different type of answer. And I think why that can be useful is allowing people to understand that they have to take up some kind of option within their change, and that we do need to create some kind of change, which is, I guess, what I'm always advocating for. And if you can show multiple outcomes of future, it helps people understand that, contextualize. But I think we're not ready for predictive with generative AI yet, because we still have some of those real-time input of data that are still difficult to overcome. I want to get back to your point earlier. Yeah.
Because we only have a couple minutes left,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I would love to go to one more question in the audience. And please, over there, just because we want to make sure we hear from everybody. Yes, go ahead.
Great, thank you. My name is Samantha Hill, lead scientist at UNEP WCMC. I spend my life thinking about how to measure biodiversity. And from my perspective, don't worry about resolution. Like even 1 kilometer resolution would be amazing. What we really need to understand is how natural a space is. So is that forest degraded? If a grassland is there, how natural is that grassland? Amazing that you're measuring crops now and know what kind of crops there are. But actually more important than understanding what type of crop is there is understanding how that's being managed. So how intensively used is that land? So I was just wondering what the panel thought about how far away we are from being able to do that kind of measurement.
That's great. Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's kind of a holy grail question, the idea of dividing the world into degrees of intensive land use all the way to intact naturalness. The longer the time series we have, the better we are at understanding those distinctions. I think your questions around degradation are the biggest ones. You know, at the opposite ends, where we have intensive land use and we have something that we think is intact. I mean, fairly good, and it's the in between that's the hard part. And I don't have a great answer for that. What is degradation? First of all, it is a very tough thing to put a quantitative definition on. By type, you mentioned grasslands, you mentioned forest. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think the satellite is our main asset for that. And for example, the basis of the reports from yesterday are a primary forest mask that we made in 2014 or something. And the idea was, where are the humid tropical forests where we don't see any disturbance, evidence of disturbance in the time series, going back all the way to the, you know, as far as we can. And if you see a certain structure that is consistent across 30 years, that you know, you can almost imply that it goes before that, right? So we created this map, and then we look from the baseline moving forward. Now, do we see degradation or clearing? So setting up the baseline with a long time series is the best way to get at naturalists. We could do the same thing for grasslands, but these places like grasslands that can be naturally interannually variable and might even have fire as part of the natural dynamic, it gets a lot more difficult. But it's like a holy grail question. It's a great one, and we need to focus on it.
We are, you know, the sign of a good discussion is that it could keep going for a while, and I know that we could actually take this one on for at least another hour, but the schedule and your bladders will not permit us to do so. So we're going to, will you please join me in thanking these terrific panelists today for this wonderful conversation? And please stick around if you have a chance. For additional questions, we'd be happy to continue the conversation off screen. And thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.